Welcome back, my friends, to the Derate The Hate podcast. I am your host, Wilk Wilkinson, your blue-collar sage, calming outrage and helping to navigate a world divided by fog and those who would spread that fear, outrage, and grievance. Each week, I'm sharing stories from my path and using the power of conversation and collaboration with my many great guests. Together, we chart a course toward understanding, bridging divides, and fostering a community where wisdom prevails over discord. Friends, it really is about bettering the world one attitude at a time. We did not create the hate, but together we can derate the hate. The only good thing about a bad attitude is we have the ability as individuals to change it. For me, it starts with gratitude and personal accountability. I am so incredibly grateful that you have taken the time to join me for another powerful DTH episode. Please remember to subscribe and share the DTH podcast with your network of friends. If you would like to support the show, check out the Support Us page on the Derate The Hate website. With that, my friends, let's get to it. Look, I'm proud knowing here at DTH we can tackle the toughest issues we face as a society without losing our humanity in the process. Today's conversation might just be one of the most complex and timely that we've had yet. I'm joined by two thought-provoking guests who are no strangers to controversial discourse, Julian Adorney and Hunter Ash. Julian is a writer, a speaker, and one of the most thoughtful voices in the depolarization space today. He's done incredible work bridging divides and helping people see through the noise of tribal politics. He recently wrote a powerful piece for Reality's Last Stand titled Why Christians Must Reject the Woke Right's Answer to Racism, and I highly recommend you check it out. Julian challenges us to move beyond both the woke left and the so-called dissident or woke right, and instead focus on justice rooted in human dignity, empathy, and the true message of unity. Race theory, or the way identity politics plays out in both policy and culture. Whether you agree or disagree with Hunter, his perspectives represent a growing movement of people who feel politically homeless, concerned about real issues, but unsure where to turn. Together, we're diving deep into the tensions between group identity and individual dignity, legal equality versus equality of outcomes, and how fear, on all sides, can drive people towards dangerous extremes. This episode isn't about picking a side. It's about asking better questions, listening with true intent, and finding our way forward, even when the conversation is uncomfortable. Let's get into it with Julian Adorney and Hunter Ash. Here we go. All right, Julian Adorney and Hunter Ash, thank you for joining me on the Derate The Hate podcast. I do appreciate your time today. This is exciting. This is a little bit different than a lot of the conversations that I have here on the Derate The Hate podcast. But for the DTH listeners, obviously many of you know Julian Adorney. He's been on the podcast a number of times, and he's actually guest hosted the podcast a number of times. And he recently came to me and said, hey, I've got this great idea for an episode, for a conversation. There's this guy on Twitter, or X Twitter, whatever. His name's Hunter Ash. He's got some interesting insights when it comes to the woke right and white identity politics, and it's something that I wrote about recently, and he's agreed to have a conversation. So I looked into that because, quite honestly, the woke right and white identity politics is not something that I've spent a lot of my mental energy on. But I'm excited to talk about it today because I think it is something in the time right now that we're in that has to be discussed. So thank you, fellas. I appreciate it. Hunter Ash, Julian Adorney, we're going to have a fantastic conversation. Let's start off, Julian. Just say hello to the DTH listeners, and then we'll move over here to Hunter.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Wilk. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much. I am really looking forward to this. I think it'll be productive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Going to be a productive conversation. And again, grateful for the two of you taking the time to join me today. So let's start this off, Julian, we're going to first start the conversation with us talking about an article you recently wrote for Reality's Last Stand. It says, "Why Christians Must Reject the Woke Right's Answer to Racism." And immediately when I read that title, I went to the idea of anti-racism, because when I think about black anti-racism and people like Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo and things like that, I think that stands in contrast to a lot of what I see as productive in terms of fighting racism or working against and productively working against racism. So then I read the article, of course, and see that you had quoted Hunter's X post on there, and I just want to read that real quick for the DTH listeners, because that gives great context to where our conversation is going to go today. So I'm going to read this real quick from Hunter Ash on X. Says, "My radical far-right stance on race is equal treatment. Ibram Kendi should be socially vilified as David Duke, probably more so. I don't think David Duke ever claimed that black people were aliens. Black Lives Matter and White Lives Matter should be treated the same. A scholarship for only minority students should have the same legal standing as a scholarship for only white students. The problem is that this never happens. Politics is a negotiation. You typically get an outcome about halfway between what one side wants and what the other side wants. If white people advocate for neutrality while other groups advocate for special privileges, we'll end up with moderate special privileges for them. No, thank you. I will not tolerate the seething resentment against whites broadcast from every major institution. I will not tolerate moderate discrimination against my people, and it seems both empirically and theoretically that the only way to achieve equality is for us to actively advocate for our own group interests, such that the final negotiated outcome is something close to equality." Okay, so was that a fair quote, Hunter? I mean, I'm assuming it is. I think I read it, tried to read it word for word. Don't have my glasses on today, but I tried to read it word for word. Fair representation of what you wrote on X?
Yeah, word for word.
All right, perfect. So Julian, take me into where you're at on this, because as I read this, there's some things I agree with, some things I don't. And I want to know where you were at when you read this the first time, and what kind of led you to this. I know, and many of the DTH listeners will know that a lot of what you write about has been about DEI and things such as that, and the poisons that DEI has brought to society. So let's start with, what did you think when you first read this from Hunter?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So kind of like you said, I have spent a few years now criticizing the DEI industry, critical race theory, critical theory, queer theory, things like that. I've criticized Robin DiAngelo, Ibram Kendi, all those folks for more or less the same reason, which is that I don't think our society gets better when we kind of slice and dice biracial divisions or by racial categories. I think that even where that's really well intentioned, it runs the risk, the side effect of reifying barriers rather than taking them down. And so when I read Hunter's thing, Hunter, I saw your thing and I thought, we agree almost completely on ends. We agree. I absolutely advocate for race equality, basically. And so we agree pretty much completely as far as that goes. Where we disagree is on means. And I thought, if I've been criticizing Kendi and DiAngelo and all these folks for years, saying that if we lean into Black affinity groups, Hispanic affinity groups, graduation segregated by skin color, the net effect is not going to be good for society. It's going to be very bad. It's going to kind of reify these divisions. And so when I saw you advocating for white identity politics, I thought, wow, I can really see where he's coming from, because it seems sort of weird that you can have identity politics for every group except for white people, and I've been very leery of identity politics for white people because we have a history of that in the country that I think's been toxic, but I'm with the help of actually one of my African American friends that Wilk knows, I've been sort of worked my way around that concept. But all the same, I saw you talk about means, and I thought, I don't think this is going to get us there. I don't think it's going to get us to true neutrality or true equality. I think it's going to get us deeper into kind of warring tribes.
Very good. And Hunter, then to kind of go to what Julian was saying, and then more so even actually kind of explaining where you were when you wrote this piece and what the genesis of that kind of thought process has been for you.
Yeah, so I was a progressive for most of my life until a few years ago, so I feel like I understand, sort of that headspace and where they're coming from. I've also been, probably, more or less where you're at, Julian, right? Which is something closer to the classical liberal position. A few things that have made me just pessimistic that this strategy could really work are essentially, basically the durability of non-white identity politics. I feel like we've sort of been trying the unilateral disarmament thing for decades at this point, right? And it's essentially like, I feel like in game theory terms, white people have been, in aggregate, right? Obviously, I'm not talking about, there are obviously people who have, had, very strong racial prejudices, white people who have, across this time period. But in aggregate and in terms of our sort of political action, I feel like we've been like the always cooperate strategy in game theory, right? Where no matter, where cooperation is essentially being colorblind, right? And, we do that and we do that and we do that. And, during my lifetime, and it seems like for, a few decades before I was born, it seems like things are only moving in the wrong direction, right? Like we're only seeing more and more anti-white discrimination, anti-white rhetoric. History curricula across the country are just chock, they seem designed to situate Europeans as sort of the root evil of the entire world, right? So my position is essentially just that, like, this strategy has not been working, right? It seems like this has been like the mainstream institutional view. It's not that I don't think it's been, I don't think that like real liberalism has never been tried or something, right? I think this was the consensus position of both major political parties in the US for decades and decades, and things have only been moving in the wrong direction. So I think we need a completely different approach. And then, maybe something we could get into later is that I even question that there was ever really a sort of golden age or like any time in our history where we got this right, where we really hit the nail on the head. I think things started to tip in the wrong direction almost immediately after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So maybe that's something we can get into. But yeah, the basic point is just, if it's not working, you have to do something else, right? We don't, like what levers do any of us here or, anyone who holds these positions really have to get non-white groups to stop being groupish, right? To stop being tribal. And like, given that we can't do that, then us being sort of the only group that in aggregate does this is a recipe for us to be permanently disadvantaged, which is not acceptable to me, right? That would apply that, I'm not that worried about how much it applies to me, right? I've sort of built my own platform and I'm largely insulated from, these kinds of institutional pressures, but this would apply to, my future kids, right? And that's simply not acceptable to me, right? I'm not willing to nobly lose this fight just because there are certain tactics that we deem too unsavory that might win it. Yeah.
So let me ask you this question, Hunter. As we move further into this conversation, then the one question that I would ask is, I often say that we can't defeat hate with hate, and we can't defeat. I would say we can't defeat identity politics with identity politics. I think identity politics is one of the greatest degradations of society that we've had. I think it's a horrible thing. Just the same way I don't believe we can defeat hate with hate, I don't believe we can defeat identity politics with identity politics. So my question for you is, and then the whole woke thing, which I think woke is probably one of the most overused words in modern times. What do you think when we have things like this or mindsets like this defined as woke right and white identity politics, is that something that sparks anything within you? Is it a fair representation? And then I want to move over and basically ask the same questions for Julian. So go ahead and address that quick, Hunter, and then we'll move over to Julian on that.
Sure. So the first thing I just want to say is that, like, I don't think that this general sort of analogical structure always holds, right? Because you could also say, like, you can't beat guns with guns. It's like, you absolutely can. And in fact, there's pretty much nothing else that will, right? Like, or, another example might be nuclear deterrence, right? So, no country that has nuclear weapons has suffered a significant land invasion since they got them, right? And in fact, Ukraine used to have them and gave them up. And, here they are. So I don't think that you can imagine a country saying, like, I'm generally against nuclear weapons, right? These are dangerous for humanity. And, like, I nobly refuse to participate in their proliferation, right? That country is going to get steamrolled by countries that do have nuclear weapons. Whereas, the other ones that do are essentially immune, right? You can't seriously threaten a country that has nuclear weapons, even if they have almost no other capability. I mean, look at North Korea, right? We would absolutely go over and knock that government over if we could, but we can't, and it's exclusively because they have nuclear weapons, right? As far as white identity politics go, I do want to clarify my position because it's probably very different from a lot of people in the dissident right. A lot of people feel sort of an inherent affinity for white identity politics, right? It's an end in and of itself, right? They're just like, this is how they want an ethno-state in the United States, right? This is sort of their organizing principle for all their politics. And that's not really where I'm coming from. And nor am I advocating for, like, affirmative action for white people or something, right? My position is rather that we need to be able to object to certain policies, not on the grounds of some abstract, high-minded ideal, but on the grounds that these are bad for us, right? These will be bad for me and they're bad for my kids, because I see anything else as essentially just a time-wasting rabbit hole, right? So you can say, like, no, I'm opposed to, any discrimination against anybody on the grounds of justice, right? And then they can say, like, well, what about to compensate for past discrimination, right? It's like, well, no, it has to be applied to, people who are alive today. It's like, oh, okay, so, like, if your grandpa stole everything from my grandpa, then, like, that doesn't have any, and that's just a bottomless rabbit hole. And it also doesn't reflect the real reasons why I oppose it, right? I simply oppose it because it would disadvantage me, it would disadvantage a lot of people I care about, and it'll disadvantage my future kids. So that's what I mean when I say, we need to embrace a certain form of white identity politics. Is white people need to be able to say, I am against this because it is anti-white, not just because I'm, sort of generically in favor of neutrality, right? You are threatening me as a group. And in terms of, like, the dividing people into categories or whatever, that's another thing we can't just unilaterally opt out of, right? Like, if we are sort of seen as white and targeted as white by, people like Kendi, people on the woke left, then it makes sense for us to defend ourselves as such, right? Almost like, you group up people for a class action lawsuit or something. Like, if somebody, proposed a policy of expropriating everybody named Julian, right? And they just want to take all your money and keep it for themselves, right? It would be a good strategy for you to team up with all the other Julians to oppose this, right? Because you have more power as a group, right? Like, these are people you don't know. You don't feel like you necessarily have anything in common with them. But what you do have in common is that you are under attack from, a specific direction because of this shared trait. And, under that circumstance, group defense makes sense. So I would say that I support what I would call defensive white identity politics.
Fair enough. I appreciate the explanation. So, Julian, let's tackle that from your perspective then, with regard to what does the woke right, white identity politics, I guess, grouping mean for you, and then let's kind of go into to what Hunter had to say there in that explanation.
Yeah. So first off, Hunter, I hear you talking about the fear of your kids, being discriminated against, stuff like that. And I absolutely just wanted to echo that. I actually share that fear. Not that my kids will be discriminated against because they're white. I actually don't know if my kids will be white. We may adopt from somewhere. But for me, the fear comes from things like queer theory in schools or things like gender transitioning. Yeah. So first off, Hunter, I hear you talking about the fear of your kids, being discriminated against, stuff like that. And I absolutely just wanted to echo that. I actually share that fear. Not that my kids will be discriminated against because they're white. I actually don't know if my kids will be white. We may adopt from somewhere. But for me, the fear comes from things like queer theory in schools or things like gender transitioning in schools. It's one of the reasons I'm a columnist for Out As Last Stand. It's one of the reasons that I'm, getting into writing about queer theory and about social transitioning, stuff like that. Is I see this stuff in schools and I think I want to protect my future kids from that. I just want to echo back because what I said, we kind of talked about this a little bit in the beginning of before the recording started, that I think a lot of folks hear white identity politics and think, oh, like basket deplorables, like you must just be like racist, whatever. And I just want to echo that I hear your concern for your kids, and that's a concern we share. If for a different reasons, it's still a very, very virtuous concern, I think. Okay, so where do I come from on the woke right? Kind of two things. One is that, I've read MLK's books, or at least two of them. I've read a fair amount about the civil rights movement, things like that. And when I hear white identity politics, I'm concerned about going back to that. I'm concerned about going back to a place where when you marry like power and majority status with identity politics, I think it can go in some bad places. Not that every manifestation of black identity politics or Hispanic identity politics in the U.S. is healthy, but when you marry that with majority status, I think it can get dangerous. Power corrupts, sort of. And so for me, partly I'm very leery of going back to that time of white citizens councils, of the KKK, of stuff like that, where the U.S. really, really had a race that was favored and races that were not favored. And I very much don't think you want to go back there either. But my concern is, getting there by accident, sort of. I really, really want to stay away from that. That's sort of an existential thing for me. The second thing, though, that really motivated me when it comes to identity politics, I spent a year in Kenya. I was there with my wife. She was helping refugees. I was mostly just kind of supporting her, work as a freelancer at that point. And we had this incredible life group. And Nairobi, the city where we lived, it's funny because I was warned against going there by my friends in the CIA and stuff like that said it was dangerous, whatever. I didn't see that at all, like barely anything. What I saw was this incredibly cosmopolitan city. And so we had a life group. And then in that life group, we had friends from South Africa, actually white friends from South Africa. We had friends from Nairobi. We had friends from Democratic Republic of the Congo. We had friends from kind of all over Africa. We had friends from the Netherlands, from the Philippines, you moved here and you were dirt broke because Kenya is actually a wealthier country than the country you lived in, and so you spent all your savings coming here. That must have given you some really different experiences. Tell me about that, And so we had this incredibly cosmopolitan group where we sort of like, we saw each other's skin color as background, but we didn't really care. We just foregrounded our shared humanity, and it was this really incredible thing. And so I came back to the US and I thought, oh, that's actually incredibly possible. Like, what if we built that here? To the extent that we don't have that, what if we could build that here? And my experience in Kenya, as small as it was just a life group of like 20, 30 people. And then I probably interacted with, a few hundred other folks over the course of my time there that I had real conversations with. As small as that experience was, it taught me when we all let go of identity politics, it can lead to some really cool things.
No, so I hear, very legitimate concerns on the part of both of you when it comes to this, and I will say definitively, I share a lot of your concerns, and I think there's a lot of common concerns here. Now for me, one of my big concerns in this and many things, whether it be identity politics or politics in general, especially here in the United States in recent years, is anything that promotes an us versus them. I understand what you're saying, Hunter, when you talk about, yes, we are naturally grouped as human beings and we are going to collectivize as such to protect our position on whatever it is based on whatever characteristic, whether it be immutable or not, whatever that characteristic is. If we're being grouped by that, we are going to naturally protect ourselves as a group when it comes to that thing, right? And it is human nature for us to be fairly tribal, right? That's been happening from the beginning of human beings. I think anything that we do as human beings to promote an us versus them mentality and try to perpetuate that, I think is bothersome. That's one of my great fears is anything that we do. Because as our friend at Braver Angels often says, those who are underrepresented in our life will be overrepresented in our minds and our imaginations. It's Monica Guzman. As we promote anything that we do that promotes an us versus them, that separates us further, I think ends up causing more problems because those people, them, become overrepresented in our mind and our imagination, and they tend to not become overrepresented in a good way. So Hunter, dive into that a little bit for me, would you? Because I understand exactly where you're coming from when it comes to how we protect us as who we are in the us versus them. But do you think that there's part of that that can be done in a better way? I mean, I know that Julian has written about King rejected the black supremacist rhetoric in his work for civil rights and things like that. I think that's an important part of this equation. So talk to me a little bit about that when it comes to the protecting of ourselves, and how can we do that from your perspective? How could we do that in a way that does not further enhance the us versus them?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I think one thing that I should definitely clarify is that what I'm talking about in these situations is policy advocacy, right? And the way that this is done, right? And I am not talking about interpersonal animosity, right? I'm not saying that you should hate your neighbor. I'm talking about essentially political grouping and messaging strategies to fight policy outcomes that are bad for us, right? And the fact is that just us being as kind and open and, sort of loving and interested in other perspectives as we can, which I support. I think we should do that. I've definitely been enriched by friendships with, people from different backgrounds, people from all over the world. And, I certainly wouldn't trade those experiences away. None of that actually protects us, right? Like, it feels good, right? It's very cheering, right? It sounds like the right thing to do, but it simply does not have the impact on policy that we need it to have, right? And again, this sort of gets back to the in a sort of abstractly laudable, but ultimately suicidal tendency to lose nobly, right? That, like, as long as I was doing the right thing, it doesn't matter that, everything went the other way and we lost, right? And that's just not how I think about things, right? So no, I'm certainly not trying to stir people up against their neighbors, right? I'm not trying to break up friend groups, right? I'm not trying to, oppose interracial marriage or, any of these things. I'm simply asking people to recognize that whether you want to perceive white people as a group or not, we are largely perceived that way by other people, right? You can see this in polling data, right? Something like 77% of Black Americans want reparations for slavery, right? Which would disproportionately come out of, the taxes that we pay, which means it's either, coming out of my pocket and raise taxes or via inflation, through money printing, right? So that means that whenever that passes, right? However warm we all are to each other, whether we all go to the same churches, right? Those people just voted to take my money, right? And in my view, that's an act of hostility. So, we are targeted in this way, and we can't simply choose not to be, right? We can choose not to see ourselves that way, but if other people see us that way, that's not much of a defense, right? So, like, imagine during the Rwandan genocide, right? When the Hutus were slaughtering the Tutsis, right? Now, you can obviously say this never would have happened if, neither of these groups saw themselves as these separate tribes in the first place, right? And that's, sort of like tautologically true. If they couldn't even recognize the differences, then this couldn't have happened, right? But once it's happening, right, it would be madness for the Tutsis to say, like, well, I'm not going to react any differently or be any more suspicious of a Hutu person at this moment in time than I am of a Tutsi, because that would be identity politics, right? I'm not going to preferentially group up with Tutsis for defense because that would be identity politics, right? No, that would be madness, right? And when the scenario gets extreme enough, we can all recognize that group identity is necessary, right? You could say the same thing for Jews during the Holocaust, right? Obviously, I'm not saying we're anywhere close to that point, but I would like to make sure that we don't get there, right? And, like, this, if you can see it in principle in those situations, then I think you can sort of understand what I'm getting at, right? Is that at a certain point, you don't have a choice as to whether you're part of a group or not.
Yeah, no, and that's fair. I think that's absolutely fair. Julian, I think Hunter makes a number of really good points there.
Yeah.
And I think, well, Julian, let's get your reaction to what Hunter was saying there, and then we'll kind of go around the horn. I just see, I see a lot of common ground here. I see, a lot of love for our fellow human beings here, but we'll get into that. So let's go ahead and get your reaction to what Hunter said there, Julian.
Yeah. No, I definitely see where you're coming from. And mostly I hear, when you talk, I sort of hear a lot of fear, and I don't mean that pejoratively, because I've spent decades in like very, very intense fear of things that were objectively very silly, which I don't think yours is, I just want to reflect back, like it seems like there's a lot of fear of like, okay, what if things get worse? What if stuff like that? And I just want to ask whether you say that's an accurate reflection of your mindset, or am I missing something?
I mean, like in the United States, I'm not particularly afraid of, widespread violence or anything like that. But I mean, it already is the case that, like, if current policies continue, right, and despite the recent Supreme Court ruling, right, which many universities seem to have decided to more or less largely ignore, right, my kids will be disadvantaged when applying for college, right? There are all these loan programs that are only available to non-whites, essentially, right? They don't say that, right? They list a bunch of, but they list all of the ones other than, white European, right? And like, so am I afraid in like a personal or bodily sense? No, right? Like what I'm concerned of, the issue is just that, I want the best for myself. I want the best for the people that come after me. I want the best for, probably the majority of my friends and, just about all of my family who are white. And I just will not, be silent while they're disadvantaged in any way, and I do think that like one thing that distinguishes, and I'm not claiming to be, to speak for the whole, quote unquote woke right or dissonant right or anything, but I will just speak for myself, right? What I'm seeking is legal equality, right? Ideally, I would want race just completely erased from the law, right? I don't think any terms that refer to race should be anywhere in any federal or state laws, right? I want equality before the law, whereas the woke left wants equality of outcomes, right? And their pursuit of that is the cause of all of the kinds of disadvantages and group-based attacks that I'm trying to push back against.
That makes sense. And one thing I want to reflect back too, I see a lot of courage in your willingness to speak up about this. You're here under your own name with your own face, which is uncommon on X, honestly, across the spectrum. And you're saying things that are sort of borderline political suicide in certain parts of the US, and yet you're here, you care deeply, and you're willing to put your name in your face to these beliefs and speak out and say, consequences be damned, this matters to me. This matters to my kids. And I really admire that.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
I decided, I thought about, whether I wanted to be, under my real name on X or not. And ultimately I decided that I would, both because I think it lends more credibility to what I'm saying, and also because it keeps me accountable, right? Anytime I think about something I'm going to say, I need to make sure that I'm comfortable with this being something that's attached to me, right? And yeah, I stand by all of this, and luckily I'm primarily self-employed, so they can't really come after me.
That's incredibly valuable, honestly. I mean, that's the other thing, we've lived through like 4 or 5 years of cancel culture. I read because I've been trying to get more of a handle on this whole movement, and to kind of see beneath the headlines, stuff like that. And so I've started following a New Right Post, Dudley. I'm going to butcher his last name. So Dudley Newbrit. But one thing he says is that, I'll probably get doxxed at some point and I'll lose my cushy job. And he's aware of that risk. We live in a society where, because I've been trying to get more of a handle on this whole movement, and to kind of see beneath the headlines, stuff like that. And so I've started following a New Right Post, Dudley. I'm going to butcher his last name. So Dudley Newbrit. But one thing he says is that, I'll probably get doxxed at some point and I'll lose my cushy job. And he's aware of that risk. We live in a society where, it's less bad now than it was, but you can still, in some cases, lose your job for the wrong political opinions. And so, yeah, again, just want to reflect back. It's actually really cool to see you saying, "Hey, it's hard to cancel someone who's self-employed, but there's still that risk, and you still want to speak up, for the things you really care about." That's awesome.
It's definitely harder to get fired, but it's not necessarily harder to get canceled, but it's definitely harder to get fired. I mean, the corrective action process is a little bit different, right? But no, Hunter, yeah. I have to echo what Julian's saying here. I think it is courageous, and yeah, like I said, I'm seeing a lot of courage here, a lot of goodwill, a lot of things that I agree with in what you're saying, and Julian in what you're saying. Like I said, I think this is a very complex topic. This is not something that is without a lot of different nuances, right? I mean, there's just so many different things, and I've talked about this so many times on this podcast that no one group is a monolith. I mean, they're just not. I mean, in modern politics, I know, especially federal politics, they try to make it seem as if things are a monolith, and then people are banished if they don't toe the line. But the reality is everyday Americans like you, Hunter Ash, you, Julian Adorney, me, Wilk Wilkinson, right? We are all in some respect involved in politics. We're figures that are known throughout different circles, and then in a lot of the same circles, but none of the circles that I run in have one particular mindset and only one mindset, and that mindset is without nuances. Hunter, do you have any I guess any questions, with regard to the article specifically from Reality's Last Stand that Julian wrote? I want to give you an opportunity here real quick as we do a little bit of a back and forth here at the end of our conversation. Did you have any questions for Julian? And I know that you had, I don't know where I saw it. It may have been in a post or maybe an email that we were exchanging earlier, but you had said that Julian's response to your, I guess, tweet there, that's still what they call them, right? Even though it's on X now, it's still a tweet. What is it called now? Just a post?
It doesn't matter. It
doesn't matter, right? I mean, whatever it's called, it's called. I still have a hard time trying to figure out what to call it. I screw it up all the time. But do you have anything to say to Julian with regard to the article he wrote? Any questions for him? Any feedback on that particular article?
Yeah. So, I mean, honestly, most of what I would want to say would probably, to take up an episode in and of itself, right? So I have some issues with the characterization of the civil rights movement and the immediate aftermath of it, right? So, Martin Luther King, rejected like really aggressive Black Power movements, but, he did want sort of, some sort of compensatory payments or subsidies for Black Americans, right? So, again, on the same grounds that people like Kendi want those kinds of things today, right? Which is to remedy past discrimination, right? So I really don't see that there was a moment when, the civil rights movement was completely clean of, sort of identitarian group advocacy, right? And you can say that you think that was legitimate, right? You can say that we should do those transfer payments or whatever, but then you are putting yourself sort of on a continuum with people like Kendi, right? Which is to say, people who believe that the only remedy for past discrimination is present discrimination, right? So that was present in Martin Luther King Jr.'s work, and also, I believe, 6 or 7 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we got the Griggs v. Duke Power decision, which immediately expanded the concept of private non-discrimination beyond all reasonable bounds with disparate impact doctrine. So, I'm not really expecting a detailed response on all that right now. I would understand, if you want to take some time to look into it. So maybe consider this just, maybe something to think about, or maybe a possible teaser for a later discussion you and I could have here elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, I would love that. And yeah, I hadn't heard about the court case, so I'll definitely look into that. When it comes to King, yes, he did advocate for affirmative action. I think a lot of my criticism of the DEI movement is they were good ideas for 60 years ago. I mean, King talked about this. He talked about things like implicit bias that Robin DiAngelo talks about. It's just that was much more true 60 years ago than it was now. He talks about things like how a lot of African Americans had this sort of like internalized oppression where they didn't think they were worthy, of kind of equal citizenship. And obviously, like DiAngelo, Kenny talked about that. It's like, it's a useful concept for 60 years ago. It was very true back then. It's probably not very true now. I think kind of the same thing with race-based affirmative action, where do I support it now? Not really. I'm very much with Coleman Hughes, where I support class-based affirmative action. Because I do think it sucks to grow up poor, and I do think it's better to grow up wealthy, and it's good if we can have a society where you try to compensate for that a little bit. In King's day, he was dealing with people who had themselves benefited immensely from the Jim Crow structure, and people who had themselves suffered immensely under the Jim Crow structure. And so at that point, I think it was probably a lot more acceptable. I think it was at that point a better idea to advocate for AA, just because it would have been sort of taking from people who had very much gotten a leg up from these ideas to give to people who had very much not gotten a leg up, who'd been kicked down, who had like an 8th grade education because the schools they were going to were crappy, things like that. Yeah, I don't know if that answers part of your response in that, yeah, it's all continuum with Kendi at one end, but I don't think the entire continuum is always bad. I think it's contextual, and now it's that these ideas are of affirmative of reparations are 60 years behind. They're outdated, basically.
Yeah, I mean that doesn't sort of address the issue of at least distinguishing between the two positions, or the support for one then or one now. So the thing that this would segue into, if we had time, very broad topics, would be one. Yes, I mean, I think it was definitely the case that like Jim Crow laws and obviously incontrovertibly slavery were highly, damaging to the Black American population. I would challenge the claim that they were significantly beneficial to the white population, right? So they either way they created a delta there, right? But I don't actually think that these things were particularly good for us, right? And I challenge the idea that they're in any way sort of the foundation of America's wealth, right? I think that in fact it deepens the criticism of slavery to say that in addition to being, a humanitarian disaster, it's also an economically very inefficient system. And the South probably would have been more developed without it, right? And then, the even broader issue from there would be how we see the appropriate role of the state, because I don't believe that trying to engineer private citizens' preferences is an appropriate role for the state, even if we believe that those preferences are immoral.
Yeah.
Fair? Yeah. It's very libertarian.
Yeah, I tell you what, guys. I mean, obviously, this conversation could continue on for a very long time. I think what we want to do here is find a good wrap point on this and leave the DTH listeners with wanting more, because there's definitely a lot more to be said here. So I'd like to give you guys each, a minute or two just to wrap with some final words for the DTH listeners. This has been a great conversation. I think it's been very enlightening. Many people, like I said, the way that I started this conversation, the woke right and white identity politics is not something I had spent personally had spent a lot of time even looking into. Didn't really, until a couple weeks ago, I didn't even know the woke right was even a thing. And I'm still not so sure how much of a thing that it actually is. But I mean, it's obviously something. So I'll start with you, Julian. Give me a minute or two as a wrap up for you, and then we'll give Hunter the final word as a first time guest here on DTH, and we'll wrap this one up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess my wrapping up point, I want to have this conversation because I want to make sure that we sort of center the dignity of every human being and focus on the respect of every human being. And I think our society's good at doing that until it's not. And one of the things that I think happens is we see folks in the dissident right, and by we I mean kind of like normie Americans, quote unquote, center right, center leftists, and I think a lot of folks see like the all Jews are bastards, or the kind of like very edgy online memes about Hitler, or they hear Kanye's song Hail Hitler, or they see widening politics, and they immediately think, nope, nothing about that is for me, which is fair. But then they also think nothing about those people is for me. And we can fall into the trap of, I disagree with someone's ideas so much that I refuse to see the humanity, and I'm just going to lump them into, call them like a basket of deplorables, to borrow Hillary Clinton's rather awful phrase. And so my invitation to you would be, can you give us something, because you know the dissident right very well, whether you would call yourself part of that or not, you know this very well. I don't as well. Wilk doesn't as well. Maybe DTH listeners don't as well. Can you give us something to really kind of humanize the DR and kind of showcase, here are the virtues that you're kind of missing. Here are the concerns that you would have too, even if they don't show up the same way. Yeah, just kind of show us like the human face of it all, even if at the end of the day we still disagree on politics.
Sure, absolutely. So, there are, it's costless to me to admit this, like there are plenty of people who, would loosely be, in this space who are pretty off-putting, right? They're a lot, to the vast majority of people's sensibilities, they're morally off-putting, and they're often aesthetically off-putting, crass, there's a tremendous amount of that. I almost see it as, this certainly isn't intentional, but it's almost a kind of disagreeability filtering mechanism, right? Because within this space, you'll also find some of the only truly original political thought happening right now, right? You'll find people like, Curtis Yarvin, Nick Land, Baptist, Bronze Age pervert to some extent, right? Like these people, whatever you think of their ideas, they are innovating, right? Like they are thinking about politics in a new way, right? They're rejecting Fukuyama's end of history. So I think that if you wanted to understand how someone could end up in these spaces, I think that you need to think about the fact that in a lot of ways, right, for some economically, for some socially, right, for some aesthetically, right, they see just a sort of, degradation of popular and even elite culture to some extent. They have seen the consensus liberal position fail for many of these people for most or all of their lifetimes, right? From 9/11, to the 2008, financial crash, right? These are people who have never really in salient ways seen the, sort of the post-war consensus work. And they're interested in alternatives, right? And I really, a lot of them go to bad places. And what I was going to say was, for my sort of sign off note, for anyone who does find themselves persuaded by my line of thinking, I would caution you to avoid leaning too far into anger, right? It's very easy to do this, right? It's very easy to see when you've been lied to in a lot of ways, and we have been lied to in a lot of ways. There are many aspects of the mainstream academic consensus as it relates to a lot of these social issues, as it relates to group differences, that are lies, and they've been meticulously maintained deliberately to mislead you. And when you see that kind of thing, right, when you sort of see through the curtain for the first time, it's easy to become very angry, and it's also easy to believe that you can adopt an essentially adversarial epistemology, where you can be sure something is false if the mainstream advocates for it, right? And that's not true either, right? They're not perfectly wrong any more than they're perfectly right. And beyond the fact that I believe this anger and just sort of reflexive, oppositional attitude is, sort of emotionally and psychologically and socially corrosive, it's also bad political strategy for exactly the reason you said, Julian, right? Like the vast majority of people are almost by definition normies. And when they see these kinds of things, right, that, you're in group, on 4chan knows all the context for, right? This is based on, a long lineage of memes, and it's got a million layers of inside. When they see those things, right, like they just, run for the hills, basically. So, stay calm, stay cold, stay centered on your goals, both because it's good for you and because it makes us more likely to succeed.
Love it.
Man, that's a beautiful way to wrap this one up. Julian Adorney, Hunter Ash, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation on Derate the Hate. I appreciate both of you very much and look forward to many more conversations moving forward. We'll definitely have to have a part 2 to this one, and maybe many parts after that, based on the amount of things that we'll have to cover. So thank you so much, Julian Adorney, Hunter Ash. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Friends, if there's anything in this episode that provided exceptional value to you, please make sure to hit that share button. Share it with your friends, share it far and wide. And of course, if you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe right from our website so you can get the Derate the Hate podcast sent to your email inbox every week. So this is Wilk wrapping up for the week saying get out there, be kind to one another, be grateful for everything that you've got, and remember it's up to you to make each and every day